Damian Blackwood laughed. Not a quiet laugh. Not the kind a man tries to hide. He laughed the way men laugh when they are certain no one who matters is listening. Loose, careless, the sound of someone who has already decided the conversation is beneath him. "She's still trying," he said, and his capos laughed with him, because that's what men like that do. They laugh together at the person who loves the most. Evelyn heard every word. She was supposed to be looking for the restroom. She was supposed to be straightening her dress in a mirror somewhere, smoothing the edges of an evening she had spent 3 weeks preparing for. Instead, she stood frozen in a corridor she wasn't meant to enter, one hand pressed flat against the cold wall, listening to her husband of 7 years reduce her devotion to a punchline at a party she had organized to honor his name. If you have ever loved someone more than they deserved, if you have ever stayed past the moment you should have left, then you already know exactly what she felt in that hallway. This is Evelyn's story, and I promise you, it is not the one you expect. Stay until the end. And if this story touches something in you, leave a like and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what's coming next. Now let's begin. The charity gala was called An Evening for New York's Future, which was the kind of name that sounded important enough that no one questioned what it actually meant. Evelyn had spent 3 weeks on the details, not because anyone asked her to. Damian's foundation had a full events team, coordinators, florists, a lighting designer who charged $4,000 a day. But Evelyn had learned early in their marriage that staying busy was the only way to stay sane inside a life that moved entirely around someone else's schedule. She had chosen the orchids personally. White, not cream. There was a difference, and she had argued about it for 40 minutes with the florist until the woman finally admitted Evelyn was right. She had reviewed the seating chart 3 times, repositioning a city councilman twice because she understood that Damian would want him near the center table without being obviously close to the men he could not be photographed beside. She understood that world, not because she was part of it, but because 7 years of watching it had made her fluent in its language. She understood it, and she told herself that understanding it was the same as belonging. By 9 o'clock, the evening was running the way she had designed it to run. The room moved the way she had intended, easy, warm, expensive without being aggressive. Damian stood near the main bar, working the crowd the way he always did, and she watched him from across the room the way she had learned to do, which was to say, she watched him and felt proud of something she had no real claim to. He was good at this. He was good at making people feel seen. She had always admired that about him, even in the years when he stopped doing it for her. She didn't need to be beside him every moment. That was something she had told herself so many times. It had stopped sounding like a compromise and started sounding like wisdom. She slipped away just after 9:15. The restrooms on the main floor had a line, and she didn't want to spend 20 minutes making small talk in a queue, so she took the corridor that led toward the private event suites on the east side of the building. She had been here before. She knew the layout. The second set of restrooms was quieter, and she needed a moment alone. She heard the laughter before she reached the door. It was coming from behind a set of double doors marked Meridian Lounge, private. She recognized the voices before she recognized the words. That was Caruso's laugh. Short, a little rough, like gravel being shaken in a tin. And beside it, the lower sound she had spent 7 years learning to navigate. Damian. She was going to keep walking. She almost did. Then she heard her name. "Evelyn's still sending me dinner reminders," Damian said, and she stopped. The word still carried in it something she didn't fully understand yet, a tone that didn't match what she expected. She waited, one hand resting against the wall, certain she was misreading it, certain that in one more second she would hear the rest of the sentence and it would make sense, the way sentences always did when you heard the beginning wrong. "Still?" That was Marco, one of Damian's younger lieutenants. 28, sharp jaw, the kind of man who laughed fast to stay liked. "She doesn't give up." "No," Damian said, "she doesn't." There was a pause, and then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. It was something worse than cruel. It was fond. It was the laugh of a man describing a habit he found slightly endearing and mostly inconvenient, like a dog that kept bringing you a toy you didn't want anymore. "She's the only one still fighting for this marriage," he said, and even through the door Evelyn could hear him lift his glass. "I stopped a while ago. She hasn't figured that out yet." Caruso said something she couldn't fully make out. The shape of it was enough. "She'll figure it out eventually," Damien said. "They always do." More laughter. Easy, relaxed laughter. The laughter of men who had finished an idea. Evelyn stood in the corridor and felt 7 years rearrange themselves inside her body. Not like a collapse. That's not how it happened. It happened the way ice shifts, quiet, structural, a change that had always been coming and had simply waited for the temperature to drop far enough. She felt it in her sternum first, a hollowing sensation that moved upward into her throat and then went very still. Her breathing didn't change. Her hands didn't shake. She simply stood there while something she had been carrying for years quietly put itself down. She had known, on some level. She had known the way you know things that you refuse to name. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because naming them requires doing something with what you know. She had seen it in the way he glanced at his phone while she spoke. In the way he stopped asking about her day, not because he forgot, but because he had decided it was no longer necessary. In the way he still kissed her cheek when he left in the morning, with the automatic precision of a man who had been doing the same action long enough that it no longer required thought. She had explained all of it away. She was good at that. She had a particular talent, honed over years, for taking evidence of a wound and translating it into evidence of her own overreaction. But she could not translate this. She could not stand in this corridor and reorganize what she had just heard into something that protected her. There was no version of those words that worked in her favor. She had heard his voice, relaxed and easy, among men he trusted. That was the voice that told the truth. That was not the voice he used when he was performing. And what the truth sounded like was this. She was someone he had already finished with, who simply hadn't received the notice yet. She pushed off the wall. She walked back down the corridor the way she had come, and when she reached the main ballroom, she found her face doing the thing it always did. Smoothing, settling, composing itself into the expression that said everything was fine and she was exactly where she wanted to be. She didn't decide to do it. It happened the way practiced things happen, without intention, like muscle memory for survival. A woman from the city planning office caught her arm near the entrance, wanted to compliment the centerpieces. Evelyn thanked her and asked a question about the woman's daughter, whom she had met at a previous event and whose name she still remembered. The woman was visibly touched that Evelyn had remembered. They talked for 4 minutes. Evelyn smiled the entire time. Across the room, Damien emerged from the corridor and rejoined the party. He caught her eye from a distance and raised his glass slightly. Not an apology, just acknowledgement. She was there. He noted it. He moved on. She watched him and she thought, I organized every orchid in this room. I argued about white versus cream for 40 minutes. And you don't even know the difference between what I've given you and what you've thrown away. She didn't leave early. Leaving early would have required explanation, and she didn't have the energy to construct one. Instead, she stayed until 11:30, shook hands, laughed at the right moments, ensured that the auction portion moved without hiccups, and stood beside Damien for the photograph that would end up in the society column of 3 different publications. In the photograph, she looks radiant. She looks like a woman who is deeply happy. She had always been good at photographs. In the car home, Damien was on his phone for most of the ride. She watched the city move past the window and tried to locate the grief she expected to feel. She found something else instead, something quieter. Something that didn't have a name yet but felt strangely like the first breath of clean air after a very long time in a room with the windows shut. She didn't cry that night. She had thought she would. She had thought that when she finally heard the truth she had been circling for years, it would break something irreparable. Instead, she lay in the dark beside a man who fell asleep in 4 minutes and stared at the ceiling and felt the strange, disorienting sensation of a decision forming before she had consciously made it. She had spent 7 years trying to reach someone who had already decided she wasn't worth the effort. That was over now. Not with a door slammed, not with an accusation delivered. Those were performances, and she had no interest in performing for an audience that had already lost interest. It was over the way seasons end, quietly, irrevocably, with the simple turning of something that had been holding its position for too long. She fell asleep at 2 in the morning. When the alarm went off at 6:30, she rose the same way she always did, moved through the same routine, and made the same coffee. Damien was already in his study by 7. She placed his cup on the corner of his desk the same way she had every morning she could remember. He didn't look up. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter with her own coffee and looked out at the garden and thought, I am the only one still fighting for this marriage. He had said it like it was nothing. Like the fact of it was so established, so settled, that it was worth noting among friends as a mildly amusing detail. She had heard it as the exact shape of what her life had become. The coffee was too hot. She drank it anyway. She needed to feel something real, even if it was just the small, precise burn of something she should have waited on. By 7:45, she had made a mental list of exactly 3 things. She did not write them down. She was careful not to write anything down yet, because writing things down made them actionable, and she wasn't ready for action. She was still in the stage that came just before, the stage where you know what you know and you let it settle, the way you let a fracture rest before you decide what to do about it. The first thing on her list was this. She was not going to confront him. Not today, possibly not ever, possibly not in the way he would expect. She had watched Damien's world long enough to know that confrontation was a form of engagement, and engagement was a form of caring, and caring was exactly what he was counting on her to keep doing, so he never had to. The second thing was this. She was going to stop filling the silence. She had spent 7 years filling the silences in their marriage the way you caulk a leaking wall, constantly, without stopping to ask whether the structure was still worth saving. She was going to stop. The third thing she did not let herself articulate fully yet. It was still too new, too unformed, more of a direction than a plan. But it had to do with the basic question she had heard her own life ask in that corridor, in the plain, pitiless voice of fact, who are you when he is not watching? She didn't know. She had stopped knowing a long time ago. She had been so occupied with being his wife, managing his world, protecting his image, memorizing the names of his associates' children, ensuring that every room he entered was arranged to his advantage, that she had let the rest of herself go quiet. It was time to find out what was still there. She refilled her coffee. She straightened the dish towel on the oven handle. She walked to the window and looked at the garden, where the last of the fall roses were going brown at the edges. Damien was still in his study. She went to find her coat. She found the bookstore by accident. That was the honest version of it. She had told herself afterward that she had been looking for something, a purpose, a direction, some answer to the question she had asked herself standing at the kitchen window that morning. But the truth was simpler and less poetic. She had been walking because the apartment felt like a held breath, and she had turned down a street she didn't usually take, and she had seen the sign in the window, Saturday Story. Time, all children welcome, 10 a.m. She stopped walking. The sign was handwritten on yellow cardstock, the letters slightly uneven, the kind of sign made by someone who cared about the event and not about the presentation. Through the glass, she could see a cluster of folding chairs arranged in a rough circle, a woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, sorting through a stack of picture books, and 3 children already seated who were ignoring each other in the particular complete way that children ignore each other when they are secretly paying attention to everything. Evelyn stood on the sidewalk for a full 30 seconds. Then she pushed open the door. The woman with the reading glasses looked up. Her name, Evelyn would learn, was Ruth, 61, a former 4th grade teacher, the kind of person who had spent 40 years making rooms feel safe for people who didn't know they needed them to. "You here for story time?" Ruth asked. "I'm not sure," Evelyn said. Ruth nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable answer. "We can always use another voice. Do you read aloud well?" "I used to," Evelyn said. She stayed for 2 hours. She read 3 books. The first one she stumbled through. Her voice was rusty in a way she hadn't expected. Too formal, hitting the words at the wrong weight, the way you mispronounce a language you studied but never spoke. The second one was better. By the third, something had loosened in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched, and when she did the voice for the bear, low and rumbly, slightly ridiculous, a boy in the front row named Marcus, who had not smiled once in the first 40 minutes, covered his mouth with both hands and laughed so hard he tipped sideways off his chair. She reached out automatically to catch him. He grabbed her wrist and steadied himself and looked up at her with an expression of pure, unguarded delight. And Evelyn Harper, who had not cried at the charity gala or in the car home or lying in the dark at 2 in the morning, felt her eyes go hot and had to look at the ceiling for 3 seconds. She signed up to come back the following Saturday before she fully understood that she had decided to. She did not tell Damien, not because she was hiding it. That was what she told herself. It wasn't a secret. It was simply a thing that was hers, something small and new that she did not want to hand over to someone who would not understand its weight. Damien would hear bookstore volunteer and file it somewhere between hobby and distraction. He would nod with the particular nod he had that meant he had received the information and considered it handled. She didn't want that nod aimed at this, so she said nothing. The following week, she went back, and the week after that. By the fourth Saturday, Marcus was saving her a seat. Things inside the Blackwood mansion began to shift in the way that structural changes always do, slowly, below the visible surface, felt before they are seen. The first thing Damien noticed was the dinner. For 3 years, Evelyn had held dinner until 9, sometimes 9:30, on the nights when his meetings ran long. She had never complained about it, not once, which was something he had registered at some point as consideration and then stopped registering at all. It had simply become the furniture of his life. The food would be ready when he was ready for it, because she would make it so. One Tuesday in November, he came home at 9:20 to find the kitchen clean, the dishes already put away, and a plate covered in foil on the counter with a post-it note that said, "Didn't know when you'd be back. Help yourself." He stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at the note. Then he peeled back the foil, ate standing at the counter, and told himself it was not a significant thing. The second thing he noticed was harder to name. She was still there. She was still present in every technical sense. She was in the house. She was sleeping in the same bed. She was answering his questions when he asked them. But the quality of her presence had changed in a way he couldn't categorize. Before, when he entered a room she was in, there had been an orientation, a subtle shift in her attention that moved in his direction the way a plant adjusts toward light. It wasn't dramatic. He had never consciously noticed it. But it had been there, reliably, for 7 years. It wasn't there anymore. She didn't look up when he entered the kitchen now. She didn't redirect the thread of whatever she was doing to accommodate his arrival. She was simply present, occupied with her own things, requiring nothing from him and apparently offering no particular attention in return. He found this irritating in a way he did not examine. The third Saturday she had volunteered, he came home to find her on the couch with her coat still on, her boots still laced, a streak of something blue on her left wrist that looked like paint or marker, laughing at something on her phone. He had stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "Good meeting?" she asked. "Fine," he said. She nodded and looked back at her phone, still smiling at whatever she had been looking at before he arrived. He went to his study. He sat at his desk for 11 minutes without opening a single file. The meetings were not fine. This was the other thing, the thing that his lieutenants were starting to notice before he fully admitted it to himself. Damien Blackwood had built an organization that ran on precision, on the appearance of absolute control, on the fact that every man in every room knew that his boss's attention was total and his patience for incompetence was structurally zero. It was a reputation built over 15 years of never once letting personal distraction bleed into professional space. He was letting it bleed now. Caruso caught it first. Of all his men, Caruso had known him the longest, had been beside him at 22 when this was all still theoretical, all still ambition and borrowed muscle, before any of it was real. Caruso could read him the way very few people could, which was why Damien kept him close, and why that closeness sometimes made Damien want to put his fist through a window. "You're not here," Caruso said, after the Wednesday meeting had wrapped and the others had filed out. Damien was looking at the surface of the conference table. "I'm standing right in front of you." "That's not what I said." The room was quiet. Outside the office, the city moved at its usual volume. Damien didn't answer. "The Ferreira situation," Caruso said. "You let Marco walk through his whole proposal without asking a single question. You always ask questions. The men notice when you don't ask questions. The proposal was fine. It was mediocre and you know it. 3 months ago you would have sent him back to redo it." Damien looked at him. "Are you managing me right now?" "I'm telling you what I see." "What you see," Damien said slowly, "is my business. When it affects this organization," Caruso said, "it becomes mine." He held the look for a moment, then picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "Whatever's going on at home, fix it or separate it. You've never had trouble with that line before." He left. Damien stood in the empty conference room and breathed through his nose for a long time. He went home that night with the full intention of finding out what had changed. He found Evelyn at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a list she was making. Handwritten, on a yellow legal pad, the kind of list that looked purposeful. She was writing quickly, not the distracted scrawl of someone passing time, but the deliberate shorthand of someone who had things to organize. "What's that?" he asked. She looked up. "List for the holiday festival. We're doing a book drive for the community center next month. I'm coordinating the collection boxes." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. She went back to her list. "You've been doing this a while," he said. "About 6 weeks." "You didn't mention it." She looked up again. Not defensively, not apologetically, just looked at him, level and clear. "You didn't ask." He opened his mouth and closed it. She was right. That was the problem. She was completely, factually right, and the rightness of it sat between them on the table like something neither of them could move. "How is it?" he asked. "Good," she said. And then, after a pause that was not hostile but was absolutely deliberate, "It's good." She went back to her list. He watched her for a moment. The particular focus of her attention, the way her pen moved, the slight angle of her shoulders, and recognized, with a clarity that was completely unwelcome, that she was not waiting for him to leave. She was simply at her table, doing her work, and he was present or absent at his own choosing, and the outcome of that choice had no visible impact on the quality of her evening. He went to bed at 11. She came in at 11:45, moved quietly in the dark, and settled on her side without touching him. He lay on his back for an hour before he fell asleep. The festival was on the second Saturday of December, and the city had dropped to 23 degrees by 8 in the morning, with more on the way. Damien got the alert on his phone from his weather app at 7:52 and thought nothing of it. He was already deep into a problem. The Ferreira situation that Caruso had flagged had developed new complications, the kind that required his actual presence at a midday meeting across town. And the temperature was background information. Then his phone buzzed again. This one was from Marco, sent to the group chain. Community center on the news. Big turnout for the kids' festival. Supposed to hit heavy snow by 2. He didn't know why he stopped reading to think about that. He told himself he was checking the route on the Maps app to see what the storm would do to traffic for his afternoon meeting. But the address he typed into the Maps app was not the address of his afternoon meeting. The Mafia Summit was a quarterly thing. 8 men in a secure room reviewing territory, operations, debt, alliances. It ran 4 hours minimum. The last time Damien had left a summit early without a declared emergency, he had been 31 years old, and the emergency had involved a warehouse fire and 3 missing men. He called Caruso at 11:15. "Tell them I'm running late," he said. Silence on the line. "How late?" "I'll be there when I'm there." Another silence, longer. "Damien." "I heard you the other night," he said. "I'm handling something." He hung up before Caruso could respond. The community center was 15 minutes away in normal conditions. In the snow, it took 35. He drove himself, which was also unusual. He had a driver for a reason, and the reason was that his time in a vehicle was supposed to be productive. He spent the drive not productively. He spent it trying to figure out what he was doing and not arriving at a satisfying answer. He saw her through the window before he went inside. The main hall of the center had been transformed into something that required actual organizational effort. Not the catered, staffed, florist-managed effort of his world, but the messier, more genuine effort of people who had spent their own weekends on it. Streamers hung at uneven heights. A banner spelling. Welcome in block letters had a slight lean to the left where someone had miscalculated. Tables were draped in paper tablecloths weighed down with books arranged by age group, handwritten signs indicating picture books and chapter books, and young adult taped to the edges. Evelyn was in the middle of it. She was crouched down in front of a small girl, maybe 5 years old, who was clutching a stuffed rabbit and looking at the room with the particular expression of a child who is overwhelmed and trying not to show it. Evelyn was talking to her at her level, not performing warmth, not doing the slightly overbright voice adults use when they want a child to know they're being nice. She was just talking to her quietly, the way you'd talk to anyone you wanted to make feel less alone. The girl nodded at something Evelyn said. She pointed at the picture books table. Evelyn took her hand and they walked over together, and the girl's grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened by 2 notches. 3 children ran up to Evelyn within the next 4 minutes. Not tentatively. Not the way children approach someone they've been told is important. They ran up to her the way children run towards someone they actually know. with the unceremonious confidence of people who have learned through experience that this particular person is reliably good. She caught one of them, a boy, and swung him half sideways and told him something that made him grin so wide it looked like it hurt. Damien stood outside in the snow and watched his wife through a window and felt something knock loose behind his sternum that he didn't have a category for. He went inside. A volunteer near the door, a college-aged woman in a yellow apron, asked if he was dropping off books or attending as a family. He said he was dropping off books. She directed him to the collection table. He didn't have books. He stood near the door for a moment feeling like an idiot, which was not a sensation he was practiced at, and then he started looking for Evelyn. He found her instead by being found. She turned from the table where she'd been helping the small girl examine a picture book and saw him standing in the center of the room like a very well-dressed person who had made a wrong turn. For 1 second, just one, her face did something he couldn't read. Not surprise, exactly. Not pleasure. Something in between those, something that went back under control almost immediately, and what replaced it was the expression he had seen 100 times, composed even, impossible to crack. "Damien," she said. "I wanted to make sure you got home okay," he said. "The snow." She looked at him for a moment. "I have a car." "I know." "And a phone." "I know that too." She held the look a beat longer. Then she said, "Can you carry boxes?" He said yes. He spent the next 2 hours carrying boxes. The men in Damien's world did not do things like this. They did not assemble flat-pack bookshelves with inadequate Allen keys. They did not argue cheerfully with a 70-year-old volunteer named Harold about the correct structural angle for a display rack. They did not distribute juice boxes to a line of waiting children while someone's toddler tried to put a sticker on their shoe. These were not activities that featured in the architecture of his life, and he had no practiced behavior to fall back on. He was clumsy at it. That was the only word. He over-tightened a bolt and stripped it, and had to hold the shelf at an angle while Harold sighed and found a workaround. He handed one child a juice box that turned out to be the wrong flavor, and spent 5 bewildering minutes negotiating a resolution, while the child explained at length and with great feeling why grape was unacceptable. He dropped an armful of young adult novels twice because someone had stacked them in a way that distributed the weight all wrong, and the second time they scattered across the floor in a fan, and 2 of the child volunteers found this so funny they had to be given a minute to recover before they could help pick them up. He didn't apologize for any of it. He didn't perform humility because he didn't know how and because the room didn't seem to require it. He just did the next thing, badly and then slightly less badly, and Harold made a comment around the 90-minute mark that he was actually more useful than he looked, which was apparently Harold's highest form of praise. Evelyn moved through all of it at a distance, available, but not managing him. She didn't check on him. She didn't translate for him. She let him be incompetent and find his footing at his own pace, which was either very generous or an extremely measured form of indifference, and he was not certain which. At one point, their paths crossed near the book collection table, and she handed him a stack of chapter books without looking at him and said, "Third shelf from the left, alphabetical by author," and moved on. He stood holding the books and watched her go and thought, "She is not performing happiness. That's the thing. Every version of her contentment I've seen for years has been performed, even when she didn't know she was performing. This is the real one, and I have never been the one who gave it to her." At 4 o'clock, the snow had thickened and the community center began its wind down, families filtering out, volunteers consolidating the remaining books and collapsing tables. Evelyn was near the far wall talking to Ruth, who was laughing at something with her whole face, the deep, crinkle-eyed laugh of someone who has earned the right to find things genuinely funny. Damien picked up his coat from where he'd left it on a chair and stood there for a moment. He thought about the gala. He thought about the corridor. He thought about the way he had laughed. Easy, thoughtless, the laugh of a man who believed he was in a room with no consequences. He had not known she was there. He still hadn't told her he knew she had been. That thought landed with a weight that was new, that pressed differently than guilt usually pressed on him, because this was not guilt about a business decision or a tactical error. This was something that touched the part of him that existed before the organization, before the power, before the 15 years of becoming Damien Blackwood in the way the city understood that name. He found her journal 3 days later. He was not snooping. That mattered to him, though he understood it would not matter to anyone else, and it certainly would not matter to the words themselves. He was looking for a phone charger. She kept a spare in the drawer of her nightstand. And the journal was right there, small, dark green, the elastic strap around it not fully secured. He should have closed the drawer. He opened the journal to a page somewhere in the middle. Not the beginning, not the end, just a random page dated 14 months ago, and read one paragraph before he understood what he was holding. He sat on the edge of the bed and read for 40 minutes. She wrote the way she spoke when no one was listening, which was to say she wrote without the smoothing, without the translation into the version of herself she'd learned to present. The entries were not dramatic. That was the thing that made them devastating. They were quiet. They were the quiet recordings of a woman keeping track of her own disappearance. Damien came home at 11:30. I'd been waiting since 8. I told myself this time I'd wait. I always wait. I don't know why I do this. I think I'm afraid that one day I'll stop waiting and realize I didn't know who I was when he wasn't coming home to. The bookstore again today. Marcus fell asleep during the story, which I'm choosing to take as a compliment. I asked him today if he remembered our anniversary dinner, the third one, when the power went out at the restaurant and we ate by candlelight for 2 hours and just talked. He looked at me for a second like he was locating it. Sure, he said. And then his phone buzzed. I don't think he remembered. Loving someone shouldn't require disappearing piece by piece. He read that last line 3 times. He sat very still. He had been, for 15 years, a man who solved problems. That was the core competency. Something breaks, something threatens, something goes wrong. You identify it. You act. You restore order. He had never been at a loss for an action to take, because the problems in his world were problems that responded to force or money or patience or some calculated combination of all 3. This was not that kind of problem. He had not lost her in a moment. He hadn't lost her in one fight or one wrong choice. He had lost her in 14 months of ignored dinners and half-heard conversations and phone buzzings that were more important than the person sitting 3 feet away from him. He had lost her the way you lose a language. Not in one day, but through years of letting it go unused until you could no longer find the right words. He sat on the edge of the bed in the gray afternoon light, holding his wife's journal, and the feared Mafia boss of New York could not think of a single thing in his arsenal that would fix what he had spent years quietly destroying. The elastic strap was cold against his fingers when he finally closed it. He put it back exactly as he had found it. He smoothed the drawer closed. He walked to the window and stood there looking out at the street and the skeleton trees, and a man walking a dog far below, and the ordinary, indifferent motion of the city going about its life. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He didn't move to answer it. The phone buzzed 4 more times before he picked it up. It was Marco. The message was short. Caruso wants a word. Tonight if possible. Damien stared at the screen. Outside the window, the bare trees moved slightly in the wind. He typed back, tomorrow. Then he put the phone face down on the nightstand and stood there another minute. And then he did something he had not done in a long time, which was to go looking for his wife, not because he needed something from her, but simply because he needed to be in the same room. She was in the kitchen. She had her back to him, chopping something on the wooden board, and the radio was on low. An oldies station, the kind that played songs nobody agreed on the name of, but everybody knew the words to. She was not singing along. She was just working, moving through her own rhythm, entirely unaware she was being watched. He leaned against the doorframe. She sensed him after a moment, not dramatically, just a slight adjustment of her shoulders, and said without turning, "Did you eat?" "Not yet." "There's soup on the stove." He crossed to the pot, lifted the lid. Steam rose. He replaced the lid and stood there and said, "Evelyn." She paused her chopping, did not turn around. "I want to say something," he said. She set the knife down, turned to face him. Her expression was the careful one, the one that had learned not to anticipate, because anticipating things he said had cost her too much over the years. He opened his mouth. And then his phone rang. Not buzzed, rang, the specific ringtone he'd assigned to the line that only Caruso used when something was not a question. He looked at the screen, looked at her. "You should take it," she said, not bitterly. Flatly, the way you state weather. He took it. He went to his study. He told himself he would finish the conversation with her when the call was done. Caruso's voice on the line was compressed, low, the voice he used when the room around him was not entirely secure. We have a problem, Caruso said, and it is not a small one. The problem was a man named Vincent Reyes. Damien knew Reyes the way he knew most threats, by reputation first, then by proximity, then by the specific weight of danger that gathered around certain names. Reyes ran a mid-level distribution network out of Queens, had been doing it for 11 years, had always operated far enough beneath the Blackwood organization's floor that there had never been a reason for direct engagement. He was, in the language Damien's world used, manageable. He had apparently decided to stop being manageable. He's been meeting with Ferreira, Caruso said. Not the Ferreira proposal, the old Ferreira, pre-agreement Ferreira, the one we thought we'd settled. Damien sat very still. Since when? 3 months? Maybe 4? Martinez only confirmed it 2 hours ago. Martinez. He said the name slowly. Martinez, who has been sitting in my meetings for the past 3 months. Yes. The quiet that followed was not empty. It had mass and temperature. Damien breathed through it the way he breathed through everything that required absolute control. Slowly, from the diaphragm, giving nothing away even to a phone line. Who else knows, he said. Me, Martinez, who is currently having a very uncomfortable evening explaining himself. And now you. Keep it there. There's more. There was always more. He had learned that 20 years ago. The first bad thing is never the only bad thing. The first bad thing is just the one that opens the door. Reyes made contact, Caruso said. Not with our people. With the other side of our world. It took Damien 2 full seconds to understand what that meant, and those 2 seconds were enough to confirm that this was not a small problem, and it was not a manageable problem. And the reason Caruso had not waited until tomorrow was that it was exactly the kind of problem that did not give you until tomorrow. Reyes had made contact with the federal people. Not a complaint, not a civilian tip, a structured conversation, the kind that came with paperwork and protections, and a very particular future for everyone whose name was on the table. How exposed, Damien said. Caruso was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly 1 second too long. Caruso. We don't know the full scope yet. Martinez only heard the edges. But Reyes has been collecting for a while. Before he decided to become a problem, he was close enough to collect. Damien set his elbow on the desk and pressed 2 fingers against his jaw. He stared at the surface of the desk. The same surface, same grain, he'd stared at for 11 years. And ran the geometry of it. The information Reyes would have access to. The people whose names existed in that information. The particular and catastrophic specificity of what exposure at that level meant, not just for the organization but for everyone inside it, including the woman in his kitchen. I need everything Martinez has, he said. Tonight. Already moving. And Reyes, I know, Caruso said. No, Damien said carefully. Don't assume you know. Come to me first. Nothing moves on this without my word. You understand me. A pause. I understand. He hung up. He sat in the study for a long time. The soup was getting cold on the stove. The oldies station was still playing. He could hear it faintly through the wall. Something with a piano, something that belonged to a different era entirely, when the idea of this kind of damage wasn't something he would have needed to imagine. He went back to the kitchen. The wooden board was clean, the radio was off. Evelyn's coat was gone from the hook by the door. She had left while he was on the phone. Not dramatically. There was no note, no statement. She had simply completed whatever she had been doing, put on her coat, and gone. Maybe to the bookstore. Maybe just for a walk. He didn't know. And the fact that he didn't know, that she now moved through evenings that did not include him as a reference point, landed on him with a weight that was entirely separate from Reyes and Martinez and the federal paperwork, and somehow, unreasonably, more immediately sharp. He ladled himself a bowl of soup. He ate it standing at the counter, the way he'd eaten the foil-covered plate weeks ago. It was good soup. She had always been a good cook, and he had always eaten her food with the same basic acknowledgement he gave to everything she did well, which was to consume it without comment. He washed the bowl, he dried it, he put it back in the exact right cabinet, which he knew because 7 years of watching her maintain the order of this kitchen had given him a map he'd never consciously memorized. He thought, she wrote in that journal that she was afraid of finding out who she was when he wasn't coming home to. And now I am the one standing in this kitchen while she is somewhere in the city that does not require me. He thought, and there is a man in Queens who has been talking to federal agents for 4 months. And my name is somewhere in that conversation, and so is this house, and so is the life I have been too careless to protect. The next 72 hours moved with the specific, pressurized rhythm of a crisis managed in silence. Damien met with Caruso and Martinez in a location that was not any of their regular rooms, a dry cleaning business on the far edge of the Bronx that had been held in a shell company for 9 years against exactly this kind of need. Martinez was a narrow man in his early 40s who had the look of someone who had been thoroughly and professionally frightened and was working hard to demonstrate that his cooperation was genuine and total. He gave them everything he had. It took 3 hours. The picture that emerged was not as bad as the worst version Damien had imagined. It was close enough that the distinction required careful measurement. Reyes had built a record over 8 months. Transactions, names, dates, 2 recorded conversations that Martinez had not known about until 2 days ago. The recorded conversations were the real damage. Names said aloud on a line Reyes controlled. Reyes had held the record, had not yet made a formal proffer, was using the existence of it as leverage in a negotiation whose terms were still unclear. He wants something, Damien said. Territory, Caruso said. The West Side expansion. He wants it handed to him clean, no interference, for the next 5 years. In exchange for making the record go away. That's what Martinez understands. Damien looked at Martinez. Is the record complete? Martinez swallowed. I don't know everything he has. I know what I heard him reference. I believe there are at least 2 recorded calls and documentation of... He stopped. Reorganized. The documentation covers a 4-month window. If it's presented correctly, it creates a pattern. A pattern that puts people in federal custody, Damien said. Martinez did not answer because the answer was yes, and they both understood that Martinez saying it aloud would not improve anyone's situation. Damien stood up. He walked to the far end of the room and stood there looking at the wall, which was plain and beige and had a faded rectangle where a picture had hung for years and then been removed. He stared at the rectangle for a while. I need to know something, he said, still facing the wall. And I need a truthful answer. Is Evelyn's name in any of it? He heard Caruso shift. Not directly. He turned. What does that mean? The house is referenced. The foundation is referenced. Her name specifically... Caruso shook his head. Not in what Martinez has seen. But the house and the foundation are enough to build toward her. In the right hands? Yes. Damien nodded once. The motion was small and controlled and had nothing behind it that he was willing to let anyone see. He said, Give me 48 hours. He drove home alone. It was past midnight. The city was in its quieter register. Not silent, never silent, but reduced to its essential sounds, the ones that remained when the daytime layer was peeled back. He drove with his hands exactly right on the wheel, checking his mirrors with the automatic precision of a man who had been cautious for so long that caution had become physiological. He had built an empire that threatened to bury the one person he had never intended to put at risk. She had never asked to be part of his world. She had married a man who presented himself as a businessman with complicated hours, and she had been smart enough to understand what those hours meant without ever demanding he confirm it, and she had protected that silence for 7 years out of a loyalty that he had reciprocated with the particular casual cruelty of taking it entirely for granted. And now a man in Queens who wanted West Side territory had her address in a file somewhere. He parked in the underground garage. He took the elevator. He entered the apartment quietly, the way he'd learned to do on late nights, and stood in the entry hall and listened. The apartment was still. The lights in the bedroom were off. She was already asleep. He went to the kitchen and poured 2 fingers of whiskey and sat at the table where she had been writing her festival list. And he sat there until 3 in the morning thinking about geometry. The geometry of damage, the geometry of exposure, the geometry of what it would cost to remove Reyes from the equation in a way that didn't create a second and worse equation. And underneath all of that geometry, persistent and impossible to suppress, the simpler and more devastating geometry of a woman who had written loving someone shouldn't require disappearing piece by piece and who was asleep in the next room, having already, piece by piece, begun the process of leaving him while remaining in the same building. He had 2 problems. Only one of them could be solved by the tools he had. He had not yet decided what that meant for the other. At 8 in the morning, Evelyn came into the kitchen and found him still at the table. She stopped in the doorway. "Did you sleep?" she said. "No." She looked at him for a moment, not with concern exactly, but with the clinical attention of someone assessing a situation. Then she went to the coffee maker and began the routine without asking him anything further. He watched her move through the kitchen. The particular efficiency of it, the way she opened the correct cabinet without looking, the way she filled the carafe to the line she'd always filled it to. 7 years of this. 7 years of watching her maintain the machinery of a life he had slowly stopped showing up for. "I need to tell you something," he said. She paused with the carafe in her hand. Her back was to him. "There's a situation," he said, "with the business." She turned then, set the carafe on the counter, leaned back against it, and crossed her arms, not in defensiveness, but in the posture of someone preparing to receive information they suspect will require steadiness. "What kind of situation?" she said. He told her part of it. The careful part. The piece he had edited for her. No names, no specifics, just the shape of it. That there was a person who had access to sensitive information and was using it as leverage. That the resolution would require his full attention for some time. That there might be, he chose the words with the precision of a man who had spent 20 years saying difficult things in controlled ways, some disruption to their normal routines. She listened without interrupting. Her expression did not change significantly. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are we in danger?" she said. The word we knocked against something behind his ribs. "I am handling it," he said. "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. "I will not let anything touch you." She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that does its work slowly, that takes inventory rather than reacts. He had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being read, the way she read him when she chose to, which was a skill she had developed quietly over years and deployed rarely enough that he always underestimated it. "Damien," she said. "Yes." "Is this why you were actually at the community center that day? In the snow?" He hadn't expected that question. Not the direction of it, not the specificity. He felt the ground shift slightly beneath the conversation. "No," he said. "Are you sure?" "Yes." She studied him one more second. Then she turned back to the coffee maker and finished making the coffee, and he had no way of knowing whether she believed him, because she had gotten very good at keeping what she believed in a place he couldn't access. The coffee maker clicked and began to run. "Then handle it," she said quietly, to the machine. He was across town by 9:30, in a room with Caruso and 2 other men whose presence meant the conversation had moved past strategy into something more concrete. The 48 hours he'd asked for had shrunk. Martinez had learned overnight that Reyes had a meeting scheduled for the following week, the kind of meeting that, once it happened, made all other options irrelevant. "So we move before that," Caruso said. "We move correctly," Damien said, "which is different." "The window is—" "I know what the window is." The room was quiet. The 2 other men, Brennan, who handled the organization's legal architecture, and a man called Solis, who handled things that didn't have a legal architecture, waited with the stillness of people who understood their function was to execute, not to advise. Damien looked at Brennan. "How clean can we make the counteroffer?" Brennan shifted in his chair. "Clean enough that he has a genuine choice. Whether he makes the right one, he'll make the one that serves his survival," Damien said. "Make sure the survival calculus is obvious." "And if the calculus doesn't move him," Caruso said. Damien looked at Solis. Solis looked back at him with the flat, patient expression of a man who had been in this exact conversation before and understood that his participation came at the end of it, not during. "Then we revisit," Damien said. It was the kind of answer that answered nothing while answering everything. Caruso nodded. Brennan wrote something on his notepad and underlined it. Solis looked at the table. The meeting ended at 11:40. Damien was walking to his car when his phone showed a message from an unknown number. Not unusual in itself, he received messages from unknown numbers regularly. It was the nature of his world. But the content stopped him mid-stride on the parking structure's 2nd level. The message contained a photograph. The photograph showed the exterior of the community center. The timestamp in the corner read 2 days ago. In the frame, slightly blurred but completely identifiable, was Evelyn. In her blue coat, her hair loose, holding the hand of the small girl with the stuffed rabbit, both of them caught in the motion of walking through the center's front door. Below the photograph was one line of text. "Nice place," she volunteered. "Volunteers, Saturdays, right?" Damien stood absolutely still for 4 seconds. The parking structure was cold. A car on the level above moved slowly toward the exit, its engine a low drone that faded. He looked at the photograph. He looked at his wife's blue coat. He looked at the small girl's stuffed rabbit. He looked at the timestamp. Then something shifted in Damien Blackwood that had not shifted in 15 years. Not in a boardroom, not in a room full of armed men, not in any of the 100 situations his life had constructed to test the specific hardness of what he was made of. It shifted because this was not a business problem. This was Reyes telling him, with a photograph of an unguarded woman and a child, exactly where the line of this negotiation actually ran. He called Caruso. The phone was answered before the second ring. "Change of plan," Damien said. His voice was controlled, completely level, the voice of a man who had decided something with the kind of clarity that didn't require discussion. "What happened?" Caruso said. He made it personal. A pause. Caruso understood because Caruso had known him long enough to understand what that shift sounded like in his voice and what it meant for the shape of the 48 hours that followed. "How personal?" Caruso said carefully. Damien looked at the photograph one more time. He looked at the blue coat. He looked at the small girl who had no idea that a man she had never met had taken her picture to use as a message in a conversation she would never know existed. "Personal enough," he said, "that I want solace in the room tonight." He hung up. He stood in the parking structure for another moment. The car on the upper level had found the exit. The space was quiet now, just the distant city sounds and the particular cold of poured concrete. He thought of the journal. Loving someone shouldn't require disappearing piece by piece. He thought of Evelyn that morning, her back against the counter, asking, "Are we in danger?" He thought of himself saying, "I will not let anything touch you." He had said it as a reassurance. He understood now that it was a promise, the kind that didn't leave room for the measured, strategic, negotiated approach he had been planning. The kind that required him to be, completely and without apology, exactly the thing he was. He pulled up the photograph one more time. He deleted it from his phone. He walked to his car, and the decision he had made somewhere in those 4 seconds of absolute stillness settled into his body the way decisions of that kind always did. Not with drama, not with the adrenaline of someone who has just made a choice, but with the cold, functional calm of a man who has moved from deliberation into action and who will not be moved back. He started the car. He drove. Solis was already in the room when Damien arrived. That was the thing about Solis. He was never late, never early, never visibly hurried. He simply appeared where he was needed with the quiet inevitability of something that had always been going to happen. He was sitting in the corner chair of the Bronx dry cleaning office, a cup of coffee on the table beside him that he hadn't touched, his hands resting open on his thighs. He looked like a man waiting for a bus. Caruso was at the table with Brennan and a fourth man, Ortega, who handled the organization's communications infrastructure and who had been woken up 90 minutes ago judging by the state of his collar. Maps on the table, printouts, a laptop open to something that Damien didn't look at immediately because he needed 30 seconds to stand in the room and let the temperature of it register before he started making decisions. "Talk," he said. Caruso talked. Reyes operated out of 3 locations: a restaurant in Sunnyside, a storage facility near JFK that existed on paper as a logistics company, and a residential address in Forest Hills that he shared with nobody and visited irregularly. The irregularity of the Forest Hills address made it strategically useless. The restaurant was too public and too permanently surveilled. Reyes was smart enough to know that certain kinds of conversation did not happen near kitchen staff and barbacks. The storage facility was where Reyes met with people he needed to meet with away from everything else. "That's where the federal meetings happened," Caruso said. "Martinez is confident." "How confident?" "He's motivated to be accurate." Damien looked at the printout of the storage facility. An aerial image, the kind available on any mapping application, but annotated in Ortega's handwriting with entry points, camera positions. The location of the neighboring unit currently occupied by a legitimate pallet storage company that operated Monday through Friday and was therefore empty tonight. "Reyes is there now," Damien said. Arrived 40 minutes ago, Ortega said. We have eyes on the parking structure adjacent. His car is in the second row. Who's with him? Two men confirmed, possibly a third inside. We don't have complete visibility on the east entrance. Damien straightened up. He looked at Solis. Solis looked back at him with the same bus-waiting expression. This is not what I wanted, Damien said. He said it to the room, not to anyone specifically. I want that on record. Noted, Caruso said. What I wanted was a conversation, a choice offered, a resolution that didn't require this room. He paused. He took that option off the table when he put her picture in a message. No one spoke. The room understood the grammar of what he was saying, which was not a justification. It was a line drawn. The distinction mattered to him. He was not sure it would matter to anyone outside this room, and he had made peace with that. Brennan, he said. Brennan looked up from his notepad. After tonight, the federal contact is the exposure. Reyes being unavailable doesn't close that file. It suspends it. Tell me what suspending it costs us. Brennan was a careful man. He chose his words the way a jeweler chose instruments, for precision, not speed. The contact was preliminary. No formal proffer filed based on what Martinez accessed. If Reyes is unavailable before the filing, the federal interest loses its primary source. Without the source, and without a proffer on record, the interest becomes circumstantial. He paused. The recordings are the problem. Where are the recordings? We believe at the storage facility. Reyes would not keep them anywhere his own people had access to, and he would not trust digital storage for something this sensitive. Physical copies, possibly a single device. You believe. I believe. Damien looked at the ceiling for 1 second. Then we need to be sure before anything else happens. He looked at Solis again. Solis nodded once, the smallest possible acknowledgement. Take Brennan's annotated layout, Damien said. I want the recordings confirmed and secured. I want Reyes to have a conversation with me before anything is final. He held Solis's gaze. You understand the order of that. Conversation first, Solis said. His voice was mild, slightly flat, the voice of a man who had made his personality deliberately unmemorable. Yes. Damien took his coat from the back of the chair. I'm going with you. The silence in the room changed temperature by 4 degrees. Caruso said, No. It's not a discussion. Damien. Caruso's voice had moved into the register it rarely reached. Not commanding, not appealing, something between them that had no clean category. The voice of a man who has known another man for 23 years and is using that history as leverage. You don't go to locations like this. You have not gone to a location like this in 11 years. There is a reason for that. The reason was containment. If I'm contained from a distance, none of this matters. The reason is that you are not replaceable and field operations are not your... He sent me a photograph of my wife, Damien said. The room went completely still. Caruso closed his mouth. He looked at the table. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and held them there for a moment. All right, he said finally. They took 2 vehicles. Damien rode with Solis, which was the first time in 11 years he had been in a car on this kind of errand, and the familiarity of it was deeply uncomfortable because it was not unfamiliar. It lived in his body from the years before he had people for this, and his body remembered what his mind had tried to organize into the past. He didn't speak during the drive. Solis didn't speak either. That was one of the things about Solis. He had no compulsive need to fill silence, which made him the right person to be beside in a car going somewhere nobody was going to enjoy arriving at. The storage facility was a flat beige complex off a service road, the kind of building designed to be looked past rather than at. Ortega's people had confirmed Reyes's car, still in the adjacent parking structure, 12 minutes before their arrival. The legitimate pallet company's unit was dark and locked, and Solis had a key to it that had been obtained through a process Damien did not ask about and did not need to know. They entered through the east side. The facility's interior was a long concrete corridor with roll-up doors on either side, fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency designed, it seemed, to maintain low-grade discomfort. Their unit was 4 doors from the south end. Reyes's unit, the one registered in the logistics company name, was at the south end itself, and light came from under its door. Solis's 2 men had gone in ahead through a secondary access that Ortega had identified from the facility's maintenance diagrams. Damien knew they were already in position because Solis received one text message during their transit through the corridor, and his expression did not change and he didn't accelerate his pace, which meant things were where they needed to be. Damien could hear voices from behind the roll-up door. 2, possibly 3, the indistinct murmur of men in conversation they believed was private. One of the voices had the cadence of someone on a phone call. Solis looked at Damien, a question without words. Damien nodded. Solis rolled the door up. The inside of Reyes's unit was better furnished than the exterior of the facility suggested was possible. A table, 4 chairs, a standing lamp plugged into a heavy-duty extension cord, and along the far wall, a set of steel shelving units that held boxes with labels that described contents nobody was storing. Reyes was at the table. He was not on the phone. The phone was on the table in front of him, and he had moved it there in the second between the sound of the door and the appearance of people he was not expecting, which meant he was fast, and he was experienced, but he was not fast enough, because Solis's men were already inside from the secondary access, and the geometry of the room had resolved against Reyes before he finished processing what was happening. One of his men reached for something at his waist, and stopped reaching because one of Solis's men put a hand on his shoulder and applied a specific pressure that communicated very clearly that the reaching should stop. The third man, the one Ortega had been uncertain about, was standing near the shelving. He went still. Reyes looked at Damien. He was 53, compact, the kind of man who had done physical work earlier in his life and still carried the frame of it. His face was composed, not panicked. He had been in bad rooms before. He was assessing. "Blackwood," he said. "Sit down," Damien said. Reyes sat. Slowly, with the deliberate pace of a man making it clear that he was choosing to sit, not being made to. Damien pulled the chair on the opposite side of the table and sat across from him. He did not look at the shelving units. Not yet. "The message you sent me," Damien said. Reyes said nothing. "The photograph." "I don't know what you're—" "Vincent." Damien's voice was quiet, level, completely without elevation. "I drove here tonight. That is not something I do. I want you to understand what that means about the state of my patients." Reyes looked at him for a moment, then he settled back slightly in his chair, recalibrating. "It was a communication," he said, "not a threat. A photograph of my wife outside a building she volunteers at, with a timestamp and a day of the week, sent from an unregistered line." Damien tilted his head very slightly. "Walk me through how that is not a threat." "It was meant to establish that you have access to information about people I care about." Damien nodded. "I understood the point. That's why I'm here." He paused. "You wanted the West Side expansion. That was the proposal. Territory, 5 years. No interference." Reyes waited. "That conversation is over," Damien said. Something moved behind Reyes's eyes. Not fear yet. Calculation. "Then what conversation are we having?" "We're having the conversation about the recordings." A beat. Small, almost imperceptible. But Damien had been reading men for 20 years, and that beat was a page of text. "I don't know what recordings you—" Damien put his hand flat on the table between them. Not a slap, just a placement, deliberate and final. "Vincent, I have been in this business longer than some of your men have been alive. I know what a proffer looks like before it's filed. I know what a preliminary federal contact looks like. And I know that the only reason you sent me that photograph instead of the West Side proposal through proper channels is that you knew the proposal was leverage, and you were deciding whether to use it or monetize it." He paused. "You chose to use it. That was the wrong choice." Reyes's jaw tightened. "You came here to take something from me. I came here to give you an option." "What option?" "The recordings. The device. The copies. Whatever physical form they exist in. You give me that, and tonight ends without any other resolution." Reyes stared at him. "And what do I get?" "You get to continue existing in the manner to which you are accustomed." The silence after that was not comfortable for either of them. It was the silence of two men who understood each other completely and were each calculating whether the other was fully committed to the position he'd stated. One of Reyes's men shifted his weight. Solis's man beside him put the same specific pressure on his shoulder again. The man went still. "The recordings," Reyes said slowly, "are the only thing keeping this conversation from going a different direction." "No," Damien said, "they're not. You've misunderstood the geometry here. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The geometry was the room itself, the positions of the men in it, the secondary access Reyes hadn't known about, the fact that Damien was present rather than managing this from a distance. The geometry was everything Reyes was looking at and had been looking at since the door rolled up, and Reyes was smart enough to read it. Reyes's eyes moved to the shelving units against the far wall. Damien followed the look. He stood up. He walked to the shelving. The boxes were labeled in a logistical shorthand. Dates, alphanumeric codes, the language of a system designed to look like inventory management. He pulled the second box from the left on the middle shelf, heavier than it should be for its size. He set it on the table. Reyes watched him. Inside the box was a manila envelope, sealed. Inside the envelope, he didn't open it there, was the shape of a hard drive and what felt like a folded sheaf of papers. "Is this everything?" Damien said. Reyes looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he looked at Damien. Something had shifted in his expression. Not defeat, not exactly, but the specific reconfiguration of a man who has made a decision and is no longer in the phase of making it. "There's a copy," Reyes said. "Where?" "Off-site. A lawyer. Instructions to file if I don't check in." Damien set the envelope down. He breathed through his nose once. This was the complication he had known was coming because men like Reyes did not operate without contingencies, and a contingency copy with a lawyer was the oldest contingency in the playbook. "Name," Damien said. "That's not something I'm giving you." "Vincent, that is not something I am giving you." Reyes said it without heat, without volume. He said it the way a man states a physical fact. "You take that, and you have leverage. I give you the lawyer, and I have nothing. That is not a trade I make." Damien looked at him for a long moment. "Then here's what you do have," Damien said. "You have tonight. And tonight I am giving you one thing in exchange for what's in that envelope. A phone call, made in front of me, to whoever holds that copy, instructing them that the contingency is resolved and the file is to be destroyed." Reyes's eyes narrowed. "And if I make that call and I walk out of here with the envelope and you walk out of here with your life intact and your business intact in Queens, which was all you had before you decided to be ambitious." Damien's voice was very quiet now, the particular quiet that had more force in it than volume ever achieved. "The West Side was never going to happen, Vincent. You knew that. You were testing whether you could get more than you should have. The answer is no. The answer has always been no. The only question left is what the test costs you." Reyes looked at the envelope. He looked at the room. He looked at Solis, who was still standing near the door with the bus-waiting expression. And then he looked at Solis's men, and then he looked back at Damien. He picked up the phone from the table. He made the call. Damien listened to every word. The call lasted 4 minutes. The person on the other end, a man's voice, clipped, professional, said very little but confirmed 3 times in different phrasings that the file would be destroyed, and the confirmation had the sound of someone who had received these instructions before as a rehearsed contingency and was now executing the other side of it. Reyes hung up. He set the phone on the table with the same deliberate pace he'd used to sit down. "We're done?" he said. "We're done," Damien said. He picked up the envelope. He carried it to the door. At the threshold, he stopped and turned back. "The photograph," he said. Reyes met his eyes. "Don't let me think about it again." Not a threat, not in tone. A statement of conditions. The way you tell a man the temperature of a line he needs to understand is permanent. Reyes said nothing, which was the right answer. They were back in the car 11 minutes after they had rolled up the door. Solis drove. The envelope was on the seat between them. The city was doing its 3 in the morning thing outside the windows. Cabs, stray light, the specific loneliness of urban infrastructure at full operation with no people visibly using it. Damien's hands were steady. They had been steady throughout. His heartbeat had elevated during the room and had come back down during the walk to the car and was now at something that felt almost normal, which was not how it had felt at 25 the few times he'd been in rooms like that. Age did that. Not calm, exactly, but a kind of practiced management of the body's instinct to treat every threat as existential. His phone had 3 messages from Caruso, who had been in the second vehicle and had maintained his position per instruction and was now clearly operating on the specific anxiety of a man who had let his boss go into a room without him. Damien typed, "Clean," coming out. Caruso's response was a single word that wasn't a word at all, just, which Damien understood as relief expressed in the vocabulary of a man who did not do relief easily. He leaned his head back against the seat. He looked at the ceiling of the car. He thought about Evelyn asleep in the apartment, or not asleep possibly, because she was perceptive and something in his manner that morning had been different from his normal manner even when things were wrong, and she had always been able to read the registers of his wrongness with an accuracy he'd found inconvenient and now found devastating in retrospect. He thought, the envelope is in my hand and Reyes is alive and the exposure is managed and she does not know any of this happened. He thought, she is sleeping in the apartment we share and she is 3/4 gone from me. And tonight I removed a threat she didn't know existed, and I cannot tell her, and even if I could tell her, it would not repair what the journal described. He thought, I have spent tonight being exactly the thing I am, and the thing I am is the thing that cost me her. The envelope sat between him and Solace on the seat of the car. He looked at it. He looked at the city moving past the window. He thought about the next morning, the coffee she would make, the cabinet she would open without looking, the way she would ask if he'd eaten and not wait for the answer to mean anything. He thought about the 7 years of that and the 4 months since the gala and the journal and the small girl with the stuffed rabbit and the blue coat in Reyes's photograph. He thought, I know how to remove a man like Reyes. I have always known how to do that. I do not know how to sit across from my wife and make her believe that the man she heard laughing in that corridor is not the only version of me there is. Solace took the highway entrance. The city opened up below them for a moment. The particular Manhattan view from the elevated road, the grid of lights, the water on both sides, the skyline doing what it always did, which was to make everything human feel simultaneously significant and small. Damien looked at it. He had looked at this city from this road hundreds of times. He had always looked at it as something he moved through, something he operated within, something he had bent partially to his purposes through 15 years of work that had required him to be consistently and entirely ruthless. For the first time in 15 years, he looked at it and thought about what it would look like from the perspective of the community center, from the folding chairs arranged in a rough circle, from the level of a 5-year-old girl holding a stuffed rabbit and looking at a room she wasn't sure was safe. The car descended from the elevated road. The city closed around them again. His phone buzzed. Caruso, a longer message this time. Brennan says with the recording secured and no filed proffer, the federal angle goes cold within 60 days, assuming no new source. Reyes is contained. We need a longer conversation about the Martinez situation, but that can wait until morning. Get some sleep. Damien read it twice. He put the phone in his coat pocket. He closed his eyes for the remaining 12 minutes of the drive and tried to locate something that felt like resolution, and found instead the quieter and more accurate feeling of a man who has successfully managed the immediate crisis and must now confront the fact that the immediate crisis was never the real one. The real one was at home, asleep. The real one had written loving someone shouldn't require disappearing piece by piece and had meant it about him. The car stopped. We're here, Solis said. Damien opened his eyes. The building's entrance was lit in the way it always was. The doorman visible through the glass, the lobby familiar and warm. Everything exactly where he had left it. He picked up the envelope. He got out of the car. The cold hit him the way cold hits at 4 in the morning, completely, without negotiation. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment before going in, the envelope in his hand, the city making its sounds around him. He thought, tomorrow, I have to find a way to begin. He thought, I do not know how to begin. I have never had to learn how to begin because I have always been the one ending things. The doorman held the door. Damien went inside. The elevator rose. When it opened on his floor, the hallway was quiet and dim and completely ordinary, and he walked to the apartment door and put his key in the lock and turned it with the same care he always used at this hour. And he pushed the door open, and the apartment had the particular quality of air that comes from a space where someone is sleeping, stilled, breathing, inhabited. He stood in the entry hall. He hung up his coat. He set the envelope on the hall table. He walked to the bedroom door, which was open 2 inches the way she always left it, and he stood there for a moment listening to her breathe in the dark. Even, slow. She was actually asleep. She had not stayed awake worrying, or if she had stopped, which was itself a form of information about how far she had come from the woman who used to wait up until midnight to make sure he came home. He should go to sleep. He was exhausted in the specific post-crisis way that settled into the muscles rather than the mind, the body's delayed invoice for the adrenaline it had lent. Instead, he stood in the 2-inch gap of the doorway for a long time, looking at the shape of her in the dark, the slow rise and fall of her breathing, the particular arrangement of her, the way she slept slightly curled, one hand near her face. He had looked at her 1,000 times and not seen her. He stood there now and he saw her, completely. The way you see something when you have come very close to losing it and have not yet lost it, and are standing in the last place where the thing still exists. He stood there until his legs told him to stop standing. Then he went to the kitchen, poured water, drank it over the sink in the dark, set the glass down, and leaned both hands on the counter and looked at the kitchen window where the city lights gave a faint reflection back. His own face, tired, unfamiliar to him in the way that faces become unfamiliar at 4 in the morning, stripped of the controlled expression he wore everywhere else. He looked at himself for a long time. Then he said very quietly, to no one, "Figure it out." He pushed off the counter. He went to bed. He slept 4 hours and woke before the alarm. The apartment was gray with early light, the specific colorless gray of a winter morning that hasn't decided yet whether it intends to improve. He lay on his back for a moment, aware of Evelyn's breathing beside him, still slow, still even, and of the envelope on the hall table, and of the particular weight that comes not from exhaustion, but from the knowledge that the hard part is not behind you. The hard part, it turned out, was this: the morning, the ordinary kitchen, the coffee she would make, the moment when he would have to decide whether to keep carrying what he knew in silence or to set it down somewhere between them and accept whatever happened when it landed. He got up carefully. He showered. He dressed in the quiet of the closet. He went to the kitchen and made the coffee himself, which he had not done in, he tried to remember and could not, a very long time. The coffee maker was more complicated than he remembered, or he had never fully learned it, having always arrived in the kitchen after it was already done. He read the side of the machine for a moment like a man encountering instructions in a language he studied but never used. He figured it out. The coffee was slightly too strong and he didn't adjust it. He was standing at the window with his cup when Evelyn came in. She was dressed. She always dressed before coming to the kitchen, one of those habits he had noted and then forgotten to keep noticing. And she stopped for a fraction of a second when she saw the coffee already made, a pause so small that another person might have missed it. She poured herself a cup. She leaned against the counter the way she had the morning after the envelope conversation, and she looked at him with the assessing expression, and she said, "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep." "How did it go? The situation?" He looked at his cup. "Up. It's handled." She nodded slowly. "Good." The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the city was doing its early morning work. The garbage truck on the next block, a cab accelerating through a yellow light, the ambient hum of 8 million people beginning their days. He had stood in this kitchen 10,000 times and heard those sounds, and they had never registered as sounds before, only as background. "Evelyn," he said. She waited. "I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." He set his cup on the counter. He turned to face her fully. "And I need you to let me get through it before you respond, because if you give me an exit, I'll probably take it, and I don't want an exit right now." She looked at him. Something had moved in her expression. Not open, not guarded, somewhere carefully in between. The expression of a woman who has learned that hope is expensive and is deciding whether to spend it. "Okay," she said. He told her about the gala, all of it. Not the version shaped for her comfort. Not the version that managed her reaction, but the flat, unedited version. The corridor. His words, his men laughing. The ease of it. The complete and casual ease of a man who had looked at 7 years of someone's devotion and reduced it to a punchline in a room he thought was private. He did not soften the language. He used, as closely as he could reconstruct them, the words he had actually said. She went very still. She had known. He understood. She had known since the gala. But hearing it confirmed, hearing him say it, present, looking at her, was different from knowing it alone in the dark. The knowing alone in the dark allowed for the small mercy of uncertainty. He was removing that mercy now, and he knew he was removing it. and he did it anyway because she deserved the removal of it. She deserved the actual truth rather than the private version she'd been carrying by herself for months. She set her cup down on the counter with a careful, controlled motion. "How long did you know that I heard you?" she said. "I suspected the night of the gala. I was certain when you started changing." "And you said nothing?" "No." "For months," she said. "Yes." She turned away from him. She faced the window. He watched her back, the set of her shoulders, the way she was breathing, short and controlled. The breathing of someone managing something large. "The journal," she said without turning. "You read it." He didn't ask how she knew. "Yes." "The charger," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "The drawer." "I wasn't looking for it. I know that doesn't matter, but I wasn't." She was quiet for a long time. The garbage truck had moved on. The city sounds continued, indifferent, rhythmic. He stood at the counter and did not move and did not offer anything further, because he had promised her he would not take an exit, and that meant he also would not offer her an easy place to put her response. She turned back around. Her eyes were dry. That was the first thing. He had expected. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. He had been prepared for tears because he understood them and knew how to respond to them. He was less prepared for the clear, steady, completely dry-eyed way she looked at him, which was the look of a woman who had done her grieving already and was now operating in the territory beyond it. "I knew," she said. "I've known for months, but I kept telling myself, I kept thinking that if I waited long enough, you would notice." She stopped, breathed. "Not notice the gala, notice me, that you would come home one day and see that something was wrong and ask about it." She looked at him. "You never asked." "No." "I was invisible to you," she said, "not cruelly. That's the part that took me a long time to understand. It wasn't that you hated me or wanted to hurt me. I was just not necessary. I was furniture, reliable furniture." Her voice was even, completely even, and that evenness cost her something. He could see it costing her. That is a very particular kind of alone. He had nothing to put against that. It was accurate. It was the most accurate description of what he had done that he had heard, more accurate than any version he had composed for himself, because it had been lived from the inside out. "I know," he said. "Do you?" Not aggressive, genuinely asking. "I read your journal," he said. 3 pages of it. I stopped because I didn't have the right to read further, and because what I read was enough." He paused. "The line about disappearing piece by piece, I've thought about that every day since." Something crossed her face, quick, almost invisible. Not forgiveness. Something more complicated than forgiveness. Recognition, maybe. The specific expression of a person who has said something into a void for so long that hearing it reflected back carries its own strange pain. "What do you want, Damien?" she said. "From this conversation? What are you hoping comes out of it?" "I don't know," he said. "That's the honest answer. I'm not here with a plan. I'm here because I spent last night doing what I do, removing a problem the way I've always removed problems. And I came home and I stood in the doorway and I watched you sleep, and I understood that I don't know how to do this the way I know how to do everything else." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you that. I'm not giving you a solution. I'm telling you that I don't have one, and that I know that it's my fault that we're here, and that the thing I did at that gala was the single most contemptible thing I've done in 20 years of a life that contained some genuinely contemptible things." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's a low bar," she said finally. "I know." She looked at him for a long moment, then she picked up her coffee cup and looked into it as though it contained something readable, and she said, "I'm not going to tell you that it's okay. It isn't. 7 years of it isn't okay, and one honest conversation doesn't make it okay. I'm not asking for okay. What are you asking for?" He thought about that. He thought about what he'd said to himself in the dark kitchen the night before, figure it out, and about how he had spent 40 years being a man who told other men what was expected of them, and had never once considered that the most basic expectation of a decent life was something he had failed at so completely that his wife had to rediscover herself without him in order to survive their marriage. "A chance to be in the room," he said, "not to fix it, not to manage it, to be in the room with you while we figure out what's left." Evelyn looked at him for a long time. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. She put her coffee cup in the sink and she looked out the window at the gray morning and she said, "I'm going to the bookstore on Saturday." He waited. "You can come," she said. "If you want." She walked out of the kitchen. He stood there alone, his slightly too strong coffee cooling on the counter, and he breathed for a moment, just breathed, the way he rarely did, with actual attention to the breathing. And then he picked up his cup and drank the rest of it, cold. It was not absolution. He hadn't asked for absolution. It was a Saturday. It was a bookstore. It was the smallest possible beginning of a thing that might go nowhere, offered by a woman who owed him nothing and was offering it anyway, not because she was certain, but because she was still, despite everything, someone who believed that people could be more than the worst version of themselves. He didn't deserve that belief. He intended to earn it. Saturday came the way Saturdays come in February. Reluctantly, under a white sky that couldn't commit to sun or snow, the air carrying the particular bite of a winter that had lasted exactly long enough. Damien wore a coat he didn't usually wear, a simpler one, dark wool without the structure that made his other coats read as expensive from across a room. He wasn't sure why he made that choice. He made it anyway. Evelyn didn't comment on the coat. They took the subway, which was the first time he had been on the New York subway in 11 years. He stood at the pole because the car was half full, and the seat beside her felt like too much of a claim on something he hadn't re-earned. And she sat with her bag on her lap and didn't tell him to sit down and didn't seem uncomfortable with him standing. They rode 6 stops in a silence that was not hostile and not warm and was, he thought, honest. The silence of 2 people who are in the same place and are both aware that the same place is where they currently are. Ruth was already at the bookstore when they arrived. She looked at Damien with the specific evaluation of a woman who had heard, over the course of months, and without being told explicitly, the outline of a situation from the texture of another woman's Saturday mornings. She shook his hand. "Ruth," she said. "Damien," he said. "I know who you are," she said, in a tone that was neither welcoming nor dismissing, but simply informational. "Evelyn's mentioned you?" A pause, waited. "Once or twice?" "I'll work on that," he said. Ruth studied him for a moment with the particular penetrating attention of a retired 4th-grade teacher for whom the reading of people had been a professional instrument. Then she handed him a box of books. "Alphabetical by author on the second shelf," she said. "Last week's volunteer put Dickens under D, and we've been correcting it ever since." He took the box. He found the shelf. He sorted the books with more attention than the task required, which was itself a form of information about where he was. A man who did not know how to be in this room and was compensating with precision. He was aware of it. He sorted the books anyway. Marcus arrived at 9:50 with his grandmother, a woman in a heavy green coat who had Marcus's same eyes and a significantly more skeptical relationship to the world. Marcus spotted Evelyn from the door and did the thing he always did, the unself-conscious run across the room, the confidence of a child who knows his welcome. He wrapped both arms around Evelyn's waist and said something into her coat that made her laugh. The real laugh. The one Damien had seen at the community center in December and had been unable to stop thinking about since. Then Marcus looked up and saw Damien. He detached from Evelyn and turned to face this new person with the frank, assessing attention of a 7-year-old who had no reason to be diplomatic. "Who are you?" Marcus said. "I'm Evelyn's husband," Damien said. Marcus considered this information. "How come you've never been here before?" Damien crouched down to Marcus's level, which was not a natural posture for him and was slightly awkward, and he didn't try to make it less awkward. "Because I was being stupid," he said. I'm trying to be less stupid." Marcus thought about this with the serious consideration it apparently warranted. "Okay," he said finally. "Can you do the bear voice?" Damien looked up at Evelyn, who had her hand over her mouth in a way that suggested she was working very hard not to do something with her face. "I can try," Damien said. He tried. It was bad. Too low, too careful, without the natural, ridiculous commitment that made Evelyn's version work. Marcus informed him it sounded like a man who had a cold trying to be a bear rather than an actual bear, which was accurate, and told him he needed to practice, and then went to choose his book with the air of someone who had delivered useful feedback and considered his work done. Damien stood up. He caught Evelyn's eye. She was still working on her face. She lost the fight briefly. A short exhale through her nose that was almost a laugh, quickly recovered. She turned back to the books. He went back to his shelf. He stayed the whole morning. He made more mistakes than he made correct choices. He put a book in the wrong section and had to be corrected by a 9-year-old named Priya, who pointed this out with zero hesitation and absolute confidence in her own accuracy, which turned out to be justified. He was asked to hold a bag of donated books by a volunteer who then forgot he was holding it for 20 minutes, while Damien stood near the door like a very overdressed coat rack. He helped a woman named Mrs. Chen find a specific author her granddaughter had mentioned, which required him to Google it on his phone with the fumbling uncertainty of a man who had not Googled a children's book author before. And when they found it and Mrs. Chen's face did the thing that faces do when something small goes unexpectedly right, he felt something in his sternum that was disproportionate to the scale of the event. That was the thing about this room. The proportions were different. In his world, the scale of things was enormous. Money in amounts that had lost the texture of real currency, decisions that moved people and territory in consequence, and he had become numb to the weight of it because you had to become numb to function. In this room, a 9-year-old correcting a shelving error was a genuine thing. A child laughing was a genuine thing. An old woman finding the right book was a genuine thing. The proportions were human-sized, and he had forgotten, somewhere in 15 years, what human-sized felt like. He remembered Ruth at the end of the morning, when the children were gone and the volunteers were stacking chairs, saying to him without preamble, "You going to come back?" He looked at Evelyn, who was across the room and not listening. He looked at Ruth. "Yes," he said. Ruth nodded, as though this was an acceptable answer that she would believe when she had seen evidence for it, which was fair. The first conversation with Caruso about restructuring happened in the first week of March, in the same conference room where Caruso had told him he wasn't present 3 months ago. The irony of the location was not lost on either of them, though neither mentioned it. Damien laid it out without ornamentation. He was pulling back from operational decisions. Not disappearing. He was not naive enough to believe that 15 years could be set down in a single conversation, but creating distance, delegating more, removing himself from the unnecessary violence that had always been available to him as a tool and that he had used with the casual readiness of a man for whom it was simply part of the equipment. Caruso listened without interrupting. "What does this mean for the organization?" he said, when Damien had finished. "It means Marco handles operations with your oversight. It means I'm available for the decisions that genuinely require me and not present for the ones that don't. It means the foundation does actual foundation work and stops being a structural convenience." Caruso looked at him for a long moment. "This is because of her." "It's because of me," Damien said. "She's the reason I figured that out. The reason is still me." Caruso thought about that. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down with the particular expression of a man accepting a small disappointment stoically. "The men will read it as weakness," he said. "Some of them. The smart ones will read it as a shift in emphasis. And you care about the smart ones." "I've always only cared about the smart ones." Caruso almost smiled. It was a small thing, a brief thing, barely reaching the category of smile before it was done. "You know this doesn't fix it. With her." "I know." "Actions over time," Caruso said. "That's the only thing that fixes anything." "I know that too." Caruso stood. He picked up his jacket. At the door he paused, the way he paused when there was something else he wanted to say that he hadn't entirely decided to say. "For what it's worth," Caruso said, without turning around, "she was always the best thing about you. The men have always known that, even when you didn't act like it." He left. Damien sat alone in the conference room for a moment. The city moved outside the window. He thought about Caruso saying "even when you didn't act like it," and how those 6 words were both a condemnation and, strangely, a form of faith. The faith of a man who had seen the worst of you and was telling you the best was still visible to people paying attention. He drove home. The weeks that followed were not cinematic. That was the important thing, the thing that made them real rather than performed. There was no dramatic gesture, no grand moment where Evelyn looked at him and the years of damage dissolved in the warmth of the right words. What there was this: dinner at 7, which he came home for. Silenced phone during the meal, which required a concentrated effort for the first 3 weeks, and then gradually required less effort, the way any discipline becomes habitual if you maintain it long enough. He learned the names of the children at the bookstore, not Marcus only, but Priya and the girl with the stuffed rabbit, whose name was Diane, and Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, whose name was Sophie, and who turned out to be 12 and opinionated about fantasy novels in ways he was not equipped to engage with but was willing to listen to. He listened. That was the other thing. He had spent 15 years in rooms where he was the one whose words settled matters, and listening had become a courtesy he performed on the way to speaking, not a thing he did with his full attention. He relearned it. It was slower than he expected. There were evenings when Evelyn was talking about something at the bookstore, a situation with funding, a parent who had been difficult, a new volunteer who showed real promise, and he caught himself beginning to compose a response before she had finished, and he stopped composing and went back to listening. And the difference, when he maintained it, was that he actually heard things he would otherwise have missed. He heard, for instance, that the community center was losing its lease. She mentioned it on a Wednesday evening in late March, not as a crisis, not as an appeal, just as the news she was sitting with. The owner of the building had sold to a developer. The center had until July. There were meetings happening, options being explored, but the neighborhood wasn't flush and the alternatives were limited. Damien ate his dinner and listened and did not immediately offer to solve it. He sat with it for 3 days. On Saturday, he came to the bookstore as he had come every Saturday for 6 weeks, and after the children had left, he found Ruth and told her he wanted to understand the financial situation of the center. Not to throw money at it, he said that specifically, because he had learned that the difference between helping and managing was significant in this room. He wanted to understand it. He wanted to know what the actual need was. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "You could just write a check," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't want to just write a check." Ruth studied him with the 4th grade teacher evaluation. Then she said, "Come in Tuesday. I'll have the board chair and our operations manager. You can hear the whole thing." He came Tuesday. He sat in a circle of folding chairs with 6 community volunteers and a board chair named Leonard, who was 72 and had worked in this neighborhood for 40 years and had the particular energy of a man who had outlasted more problems than he could count by simply refusing to treat any of them as insurmountable. They went through the numbers, the lease, the alternatives, the gap between what they had and what they needed. Damien asked questions, specific questions, the kind that came from actually reading the documents they had shared before the meeting. Leonard noticed. He answered the questions with the respect of a man who is used to people showing up uninformed and was recalibrating. At the end of the meeting, Damien said, "I want to put together a proposal for permanent space, not a donation to the existing situation, a long-term solution. I'll need 2 weeks and I'll need access to your financials." The room looked at him. Leonard said, "Who are you exactly?" Damien said, "Someone who should have been in this room a long time ago." Leonard looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn, who had been sitting 2 chairs away and had not said a word throughout. She gave Leonard a look that was not an endorsement exactly, but was something, a slight inclination of her head, a small release of the careful expression, something that said, "This is what I know of him. You can judge the rest." Leonard looked back at Damien. 2 weeks, he said. The evening in April, the cherry blossom evening, arrived the way such evenings arrive. Not announced, not arranged, just appearing in the logic of the season. He had told her he wanted to walk. She had said yes. They were in the habit now of doing occasional things that required physical presence and no specific agenda, which was a habit they had not had before and which had grown up between them the way such habits do, without discussion, through repetition. They walked into the park at the south entrance and headed toward the reservoir without deciding to, the way you walk toward things you've walked toward before. The trees were in full flower, so the particular extravagant temporary flower of cherries in April, the kind of beauty that makes itself known partly through its own impermanence, white and pale pink against the early evening sky. They had been walking for 20 minutes, mostly in comfortable silence, the kind of silence they had not had in the early months, but that had been building slowly, the way things build when you stop fighting the process. He stopped on the path under one of the trees. She stopped beside him. He looked at the blossoms for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to actually say it and not edit it into the version that sounds better, so it might not come out well." She turned to face him. The light was doing the particular thing it does in parks in April, soft, slightly golden, more forgiving than the light had any obligation to be. "The night at the gala," he said. "What I said to those men. I have gone back to that moment. I don't know how many times, trying to understand how I said it. Not with malice. That's the part that stays with me. If I had said it with malice, I could tell myself it was a bad night, an aberration. I said it the way you talk about furniture, easy, relaxed. He looked at the tree. I said it that way because that's where I actually was. I hadn't chosen to get there. I just arrived there, slowly, without noticing, the way you drift off course, without ever making a decision to. She was listening. She was always listening now when he said things that cost him something. She had started doing that, recognizing when something was real rather than managed, and paying it a particular quality of attention. He didn't know if she knew she did it. He didn't think he would tell her. I read 3 pages of your journal, he said. I have wished, since then, that I had been the person who made it so you never needed to write those pages. I can't make that true. I can't go back and be the husband you deserved in years 2 and 4 and 6. That person doesn't exist anymore as an available option. He paused. What exists is now. And now I'm coming home for dinner, and I'm learning the names of the children, and I'm in the meetings about the community center lease, and I'm standing in a park telling you something I should have said 8 months ago, which is this. I am ashamed of what I did. Not guilty, not sorry, ashamed. There's a difference. Guilt is about the act. Shame is about what the act says about who you were. She looked at him for a long time. The blossoms moved slightly in the wind. One fell. The particular slow spiral of a cherry blossom falling, which is one of the unhurried things in a world that doesn't offer many. I know the difference, she said. I know you do. She looked at the tree. She was quiet for a moment, not the careful quiet, but the thinking quiet, the one he'd learned to wait out. When I heard you in that corridor, she said, I thought the worst part was what you said. I spent months thinking that was the worst part. She paused. But the worst part wasn't what you said. The worst part was that I wasn't surprised. She said it without self-pity, without accusation, as a plain statement of fact. I had gotten so far from expecting to be chosen by you that hearing you confirm it out loud almost felt like relief, like I could finally stop wondering if I was imagining it. He absorbed that. She turned back to him. The journal, the part about disappearing piece by piece, I meant that when I wrote it. I was disappearing, and not because of you specifically, because I let myself disappear. I kept making myself smaller to fit around your life, and I told myself that was love. She shook her head, a small motion, more internal than external. It isn't. Love isn't the same thing as erasure. No, he said, it isn't. I am not the same person I was at that gala, she said. I need you to understand that. Whatever we're building now, we're building it with who I am now, not who I was. And who I am now is someone who has dinner at 7 with or without you. Who knows the children's names independent of whether you do. Who was going to find a way to be okay whether you changed or not. I know, he said. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I know that too. She looked at him. Then I'm saying it so we're clear. Because I am not fighting for this marriage anymore the way I was before. I stopped fighting for it the night I heard you laugh. She held his gaze. What I'm doing now is choosing it, every day, on purpose. That's different. He understood the difference. It was the difference between clinging and choosing, between the desperate grip of someone who has nothing else, and the open hand of someone who has found herself and is holding something else alongside that, voluntarily, because it has earned the holding. I know I haven't earned it, he said. No, she said. You haven't, not fully. A pause. But you're in the room. And you're not managing the room. And you knew Diane's name last Saturday before I said it. Something moved in her expression. Small, careful, the first warmth that wasn't qualified. That's not nothing. He reached out, slowly, and she watched his hand come toward hers with the same assessing attention she gave everything. Not suspicious, not eager, just present. And when he took her hand, she let him. Her fingers adjusting around his with the muscle memory of 7 years overlaid with everything that had happened in the month since, and they stood under the cherry tree while the blossoms fell in their own time, and the park moved around them with the complete indifference of the natural world to human drama. They stood there for a while. Then she said, The board meeting is Thursday. Leonard wants your proposal. It's ready, he said. Is it good? It's the best thing I've built in 15 years, he said. And it's the first thing I've built that I can actually say that about. She looked at him sidelong. That's a big claim. I know. Don't oversell it to Leonard. He's been undersold to and oversold to for 40 years and he can tell the difference immediately. I wasn't going to oversell it. You were a little, she said. You do that. You lead with the definitive statement and then back it up. It works in your world. Leonard's not your world. He considered this. You're coaching me. I'm telling you what I know about a man I've been watching for 6 weeks. You're coaching me, he said again, this time without the question. Something in her expression shifted. The warmth again, less guarded this time, and behind it something older, something from before the gala, from the early years when they were still learning each other, and it was good. The version of her he had been careless with. Maybe a little, she said. They started walking again. The path curved around the reservoir and the city was visible above the tree line on the east side, the skyline doing its usual thing, existing, enormous, lit, permanent seeming, and actually made of components that were each individually fragile and contingent. He knew that about buildings now in a way he hadn't known before. From the meetings with Leonard, from understanding the actual mechanics of how a community center stayed open against the pressure of a city that made staying open very difficult. He thought about Caruso saying the best thing about you, even when you didn't act like it. He thought about Marcus asking about the bear voice with complete, uncomplicated directness, the way children asked for things before they had learned that wanting makes you vulnerable. He thought about the line in the journal, disappearing piece by piece. He thought about Evelyn in this park beside him, their hands still together, walking at the pace of people who are not going somewhere urgently, but are going somewhere, who have a direction without a deadline. He had spent 15 years building something that required him to be fearless in specific, sanctioned ways. He understood now that fearlessness in those ways had been, in a certain sense, easy. It had the architecture of a game around it, rules and stakes he understood, tools he'd been trained to use. This was harder. This was the specific and unglamorous fearlessness of continuing to show up to a thing that might not work, of sitting in folding chairs at board meetings, of sorting books alphabetically in a room where your reputation meant nothing, and the only currency was whether you actually showed up and actually stayed. He was learning to use different tools. He was not fast at it. He made errors. He overmanaged things and caught himself and stopped. He arrived at dinner having clearly had a difficult day and was quiet about it in ways that were sometimes the old quiet, closed, impenetrable, and he had to actively choose the different kind of quiet, the kind that admitted something without requiring it to be made into a conversation. He was not always successful. There were evenings when she looked at him and he could see her noting it, noting the closed quality, measuring it against the new standard he was attempting to hold himself to, and he would make himself open the door even a fraction, enough to let in air. The board meeting went well. Leonard asked 8 questions, and Damien answered 7 of them directly, and admitted for the 8th that he didn't have the answer and would get it. Leonard made a note. After the meeting, Leonard shook his hand and said, "You'll do," in the tone of a man who had decided something and was not going to elaborate. Evelyn told him later that "you'll do" from Leonard was the highest available praise. He believed her. The lease for the permanent space was signed in June. It was not the most complicated deal he had ever structured. It was not the most expensive. It was, without question, the one he was proudest of, and the pride felt different from professional pride. It was quieter, less requiring of an audience, more connected to something he could not entirely name, but that had to do with a room full of folding chairs and a boy who fell sideways off one, laughing, and a woman who had written her loneliness down in a green journal and deserved to never have to write it again. He was not a different man. He needed to be clear about that, even with himself, especially with himself. I was the same man who had stood in a private lounge at a charity gala and laughed with his men at the devotion of his wife. He was the same man who had built an organization on fear and managed Reyes with the machinery of that organization and stood outside a storage facility in Queens at midnight with an envelope in his hand. He was that man. He would not pretend otherwise, not to Evelyn, not to himself. What he was doing was choosing every day what that man did with the hours he had. Not atoning. He was under no illusion that what he had been was something that could be atoned for by correct behavior in the months that followed. Not transforming. Transformation was what people claimed when they wanted to leave the cost of what they'd been behind them without actually paying it. He was choosing. That was the word she had used, standing under the cherry tree. He was using her word because it was the right word. Every day, on purpose. To be in the room, to come home for dinner, to learn the names of the children, to sit in folding chairs and admit when he didn't have an answer, and come back the following Tuesday with the answer he'd gone and found. One evening in July, when the permanent space had been occupied for 3 weeks, and the shelves were fully stocked, and the children's reading circle had moved from the bookstore to the new room with the better light, Damien and Evelyn walked home from the center together in the long summer evening, the city warm around them, the streets in the particular easy mood of a July night that has decided to be pleasant. They walked without talking for a while. Then she said, "Marcus asked me today if you were coming back next week. What did you tell him?" "I told him yes," she said. "I told him you always come back." He looked at her. She was looking at the street ahead of them, her profile clean against the evening light, her expression its ordinary expression, not performing anything, not guarding anything, simply present in the evening the way she had learned to be present in her own life. He had almost lost this. He had been losing it for years without knowing it, and then he had known it and spent months in the long, uncinematic work of earning his way back into the same room. And here was the room, a summer sidewalk, the city moving around them, her hand finding his without either of them deciding it, the way things happen when they have become familiar again. "I always come back," he said. She nodded once, the small nod that wasn't agreement exactly, but was acknowledgement. The particular acknowledgement of a woman who was still watching, still measuring, still making her choices daily and deliberately and for herself, and who was choosing today this. The street went on. They walked.